For this presentation, I wanted to talk about my favourite video game of all time, Persona 4. It is a game that not only changed my life, but also effectively demonstrates the relationship between Asian media and the rest of the world, and the cultural flows that tie them together. Unfortunately, since the game originally came out for the PlayStation 2 in 2008, and the enhanced remake Golden hit the PS Vita in 2012, it would seem that I'm plumb out of luck. Fortunately, its sequel, Persona 5, received its own enhanced remake, Royal, in April 2020, and in June of the same year, Persona 4 Golden was also ported to the PC for the first time. As these games are similar and share many of the same traits and themes, coupled with the fact they both came out within the last year or so, I'm going to be referring to both of them. In Persona, you play as a typical Japanese high school student who, through pure chance, awakens the power to summon the physical manifestation of their psyche to do battle against shadows, monsters that represent the repressed emotions of the subconscious. It's all very surreal and philosophical, and there's an overarching plot involving a murder spree or societal upheaval. Even without this context though, there are a number of things that stand out at first glance for both of these games. Their anime aesthetic, their turn-based JRPG gameplay, and their setting, taking place predominantly in Japan. Let's look at the significance of the anime style first. In recent years, anime has become more prevalent in the West, but it hasn't always been this way. Back in the 80s and early 90s, anime was considered a geeky niche, and was difficult if not impossible to legally acquire, save for a few exceptions that saw Western releases. The mid-90s saw two big changes: the advent of the internet, which began to allow anime fans around the world to connect and share shows online, and a shift from US TV companies producing their own cartoons to the cheaper option of importing and localizing Japanese anime such as Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, and Pokemon. Not only did this help to kill off some of my favourite cartoon shows like Animaniacs, but it opened up an as yet untapped revenue stream for the anime companies themselves, creating a multi-billion-dollar multimedia foreign market that included video games, which makes up a significant portion of a studio's profits. Consalvo suggests that cross-national influence is so common in video games in the West as well as Asia that the whole industry should be considered a hybrid, with its own sphere of influence free from national borders. Furthermore, the success of anime in the West is an example of media contraflow in the typical West to Asia model, in which an Asian media has emerged from Japan and successfully established itself in Western markets. Indeed, anime and its distinctive designs and tropes have become so recognisable in the West that the 2020 Animaniacs reboot features a scene that homages the very media that helped see it cancelled 23 years prior. With that, we've gone full circle. But what about the gameplay itself? Persona is a Japanese role-playing game, or JRPG. Aside from the region in which they're developed, JRPGs are distinguishable from more Western role-playing games due to a couple of key features. They will often be narrative-heavy, mostly linear experiences with random turn-based battles where a party of heroes defeat packs of enemies repeatedly until they level up, reach the dungeon boss, defeat him, and then more story happens. They will often also have an anime-esque graphical style. This style of gameplay is not exclusively enjoyed by Japanese gamers, but JRPGs tend to be preferred in Japan over Western RPGs, which tend to skew towards real-time action-based combat systems and will often opt for a more gritty or realistic look without the anime trimmings. As such, JRPGs tend to be designed with a Japanese audience in mind, and many never see a release on Western shores. Come on Nintendo, we're still waiting on Mother 3. But it's not just the gameplay design that can limit a game's appeal, its thematic and cultural content can as well. Japanese video game company Nintendo tend to court as wide an audience as possible with their games by making them either culturally odorless, or to use strategic hybridism by having them fuse elements of Japanese culture while also drawing from a wide variety of international cultures. Most Super Mario games occur in the fictional and culturally odor-free Mushroom Kingdom, although Super Mario Odyssey has a level, New Donk City, which is heavily influenced by New York, and also Donkey Kong. Pokemon, a series that almost didn't make it to the West because the developers Game Freak thought it was too geared towards Japanese audiences, we wouldn't get the appeal, changes regions with each game and has featured worlds based on France, America, Hawaii, and most recently, England. Pelletieri says the more the creators manage to bring features of Japanese culture and society together with cultural elements more frequent in other areas of the world, the higher will be the probability that such work, other conditions being satisfied, will gain a universal success. How does all of this relate to Persona? Persona is unquestionably Japanese. In both of these games, you play as a Japanese high school student living an admittedly somewhat abnormal student life in either the fictional rural Japanese town of Inaba or the bustling city streets of Tokyo. You can visit and walk around famous real-world locations such as Akihabara or Shibuya Crossing, hi Hachiko, or spend time at Shinto shrines or in bathhouses. The game mentions the Japanese diet and expects you to know it's a political thing rather than a weight loss program. Real-world Japanese public holidays are referred to, such as Golden Week, something that we don't have in the West. There is no mistaking the strong Japanese influence of Persona, so why are these games seeing a significant increase in interest from Western gamers? There are a few reasons, one being that they're just really good games, and another being that Persona 5 in particular is excellent for virtual tourism, something I didn't know was a thing until COVID-19 confined us to our homes in 2020. Aside from this, though, a strong case can be made that this is a result of a more cosmopolitan media landscape in the West. Our increased exposure to Asian media has bred a familiarity and acceptance that just didn't exist before. Those of us who grew up watching anime in the 90s or playing JRPGs like Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger on our Super Nintendos, and anyone else who's grown up since then, they've done so in a world where a not insignificant portion of the media we've consumed has been of Asian origin, whether we realised it at the time or not. Aside from this, the argument can also be made that part of Persona's appeal is that it's so obviously Japanese. Pelletieri makes the point that Western audiences can appreciate Japanese culture as is, and part of its appeal to non-Japanese consumers is its unfamiliarity and exoticism. This idea of cool Japan did not go unnoticed by the Japanese government, who in 2009 appointed 3 kawaii ambassadors, or ambassadors of cuteness, who would travel to events around the world promoting Japanese fashion and kawaii culture. This followed the previous year's appointment of the first ever anime ambassador, the role going to popular Japanese children's character Doraemon. Aside from the visuals, the setting, and the gameplay style, there's another consideration to consider when it comes to Persona's culture: the story and overall theme. Persona 4 is a journey of self-discovery, coming to acknowledge and accept the aspects of your personality or being that you'd rather keep hidden from others. Characters confront issues such as sexual and gender identity, self-doubt, and a lack of self-worth, among other things. In Persona 5, you're fighting back against a cruel and unjust society by changing the hearts of corrupted, rotten adults who either manipulate the system at the expense of others, or sit idly by and just let it happen. In both games, your characters draw strength, both figuratively and literally, through the bonds of friendship you build with your peers and confidants. The issues that the characters face, the struggles that they must overcome, these are not specific to any one culture. These are things that people deal with all around the world. This makes it relatable to pretty much anyone who's ever been a teenager and questioned their place in the world. That is not to say that all the themes present translate perfectly. Some of the finer details are lost in translation due to cultural differences between Japan and the West, such as how the main character in Persona 5 is treated like a hardened criminal with no future after being falsely convicted of what we in the West would consider a relatively minor crime. Despite this, the main themes and the message that the story is attempting to portray hold true regardless of the consumer's location. This is helped through the efforts of the game's localization team, which not only translates the original text from Japanese to English, but also makes subtle adjustments to make a more enjoyable product for Western audiences while maintaining the core story and theme. This can create some odd moments that require the audience to suspend their disbelief, such as when characters are supposed to be speaking in Japanese, but the voice actors are speaking in English, using Japanese honorifics like san or senpai, and then acting surprised that one of them can actually speak fluent English in the game. It's thanks to these localization efforts and the relatable themes and story beats that I would argue that Persona, despite being heavily culturally centered, is an example not just of a transnational work, but a crossover as well. Kavori defines crossover cinema as a site that draws on the specifics of one locale to address more universalistic themes, and we've established that barring a few instances of values dissonance, that the game is able to transgress genre, audience, and cultural borders. This explains Persona's broad appeal around the world to the point that not only did they each receive updated remakes in their Golden and Royal versions, but numerous spin-off titles as well, of varying quality. I'm not naive enough to think that either Persona game we've looked at today demonstrates an accurate portrayal of Japanese life, even the parts where you're not entering a metaverse of people's unconscious desires in order to kill God with the power of friendship. However, aside from helping me on a personal level, Persona's charm and depiction of Japan and its culture influenced me enough to want to know more and experience it for myself, which I did when I visited in 2018 and I drove a go-kart through the streets of Tokyo dressed as Bowser. I'm very cultured, you see.
You never see it coming.